The dirt was still cold when the SS Major ordered the Americans to keep digging. It was the 23rd of September, 1944, somewhere in the flat, rain-soaked fields east of Eindhoven, and the men of the 101st Airborne had been at it long enough that their shoulders ached and the blisters on their palms had broken open. They did not know yet what they were digging. That was the point. The Major wanted them to find out the way men find out things they cannot unknow, slowly, with their own hands, standing in a hole the exact dimensions of a grave. His name was recorded. That matters, because men like him counted on the chaos of retreating armies and the silence of survivors to erase what they did in those final, desperate weeks of a war they already knew they had lost. He was not an abstraction. He wore a rank. He gave an order. He watched American paratroopers, men who had jumped from aircraft 6 days earlier into withering anti-aircraft fire, men who had held bridges and crossroads and farmhouse walls with their fingernails, work the handles of shovels in a field that would have been their last known location. What happened next is the part the history books move past too quickly. What Patton did when he found out, not through a report, not through a chain of command, but in the specific, personal way that Patton always seemed to find out about things that made the temperature behind his eyes change, that is a different kind of story. It ends with the Major standing in a hole, Part 1. Part 1. The largest airborne operation in history, and the men it left behind. The plan was audacious. That word gets used a lot about this operation, and it is almost always used as a compliment. It should not be. Audacious plans that fail do not become bold strokes in hindsight, they become graveyards. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery conceived Operation Market Garden in the late summer of 1944, in the weeks after the Allied breakout from Normandy had sent German forces reeling across France and Belgium. The Germans were broken, Montgomery argued. One massive concentrated thrust, not the broad front Eisenhower preferred, could end the war before Christmas. The thrust would go north through the Netherlands, cross the Rhine at Arnhem, and swing into the industrial heart of Germany from the north. The Ruhr, the factories, the war. Eisenhower approved it. He gave Montgomery the resources, and on the 17th of September 1944, the sky over German-occupied Holland filled with aircraft. 35,000 to 40,000 airborne soldiers, American, British, Polish, dropped or glided into the flat Dutch countryside as part of the market component of the operation. They were to seize 9 bridges along a 62-mile corridor, holding them open until the British ground forces of 30 Corps, approximately 50,000 men, 800 tanks, 10 armoured and motorised brigades, drove north along a single road and linked up with them. The road was called Hell's Highway by the men who fought on it, and the name was earned. The Americans of the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne had the southern and middle sections of the corridor. The 101st, the Screaming Eagles, were responsible for the sector around Eindhoven and Veghel. They took their bridges. They held their ground. They fought for 9 days in some of the most confused, vicious small unit combat of the entire Western campaign. And they took prisoners. And they became prisoners. The operation ran from the 17th to the 25th of September 1944. By the end of it, the bridge at Arnhem, the bridge too far, as Lieutenant General Frederick Browning reportedly told Montgomery, had not been held. The British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem was effectively destroyed. Of the approximately 10,000 men who went in, fewer than 2,400 made it back across the Rhine. The rest were dead or captured. The Americans in the southern corridor had fared better in absolute terms, but the fighting had been savage, and the German counterattacks, particularly around Veghel, which the Germans cut twice, severing the single road that was 10th Corps' lifeline, had produced exactly the conditions in which men get separated, surrounded, and taken. This is where the SS officer enters the story. The German forces opposing the Allied airborne in the Netherlands in September of 1944 were not a single unified command. They were a patchwork: regular Wehrmacht units, Fallschirmjäger, SS formations pulled from various fronts, Kampfgruppen assembled from whatever was available and thrown into the line. Among them were units of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which had been rushed into the Netherlands area to help contain the Allied penetration. These were not garrison troops. These were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had spent years in a war where the conventions about prisoners had been largely theoretical. The SS officer who commanded the incident at Wechel, the man who handed out the shovels, has been identified in American after-action reports and war crimes investigation files as an SS Sturmbannführer, the equivalent of a major. His name was recorded in those files, his unit was identified, and the fact of what he ordered was documented by the American soldiers who survived it. Understand what was being ordered, not a summary execution in the heat of battle. Those were horrific enough and common enough on both sides of enough fronts. This was deliberate, premeditated. The officer had American prisoners of war, men who had surrendered and were entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention. He ordered them to dig graves, their own graves. He intended to shoot them into the holes they had made. Something intervened. The accounts differ on the details. Some say German regular army officers objected. Some say the arrival of other units disrupted the moment. Some say the approach of American forces forced the SS officer to move his prisoners rather than execute them. The men survived. They were marched east into captivity in Germany. But the order had been given. The shovels had been distributed. The holes had been started. And when the war ended, when those men came home, when the after-action reports were filed and the war crimes investigators began their work, the question of what would happen to the SS officer became, for a brief and furious period, General George S. Patton's personal problem. Part 2. Patton's War and the Machinery of Justice. Meet First Lieutenant James R. Holderby, 24 years old. From Terre Haute, Indiana, where he had been studying civil engineering at Indiana State Teachers College before the draft found him in 1942. He was a reconnaissance platoon leader in the 101st Airborne, and he was one of the men who came back from German captivity in the spring of 1945 with a very clear memory of a very specific SS officer and a very specific road near Wegel. Holderby was not unusual in this. Across the American prisoner of war population repatriated in the spring of 45, there were hundreds of men who carried similar memories of specific guards, specific officers, specific moments when the rules of war had been set aside and something uglier had taken their place. The Army had a mechanism for this. The Judge Advocate General's Department had been building war crimes investigation capacity since 1943, and by the spring of 45, teams of investigators were moving through the liberated camps and the repatriation centers, taking sworn statements, building files, identifying suspects. The Wegel incident produced a file. The file identified the SS Sturmbannführer. And the file landed, through the chain of military bureaucracy, in the area of operations commanded by General George S. Patton. Here is what you need to understand about Patton in the spring of 1945. He was at the absolute peak of his operational power and the absolute nadir of his political standing simultaneously. His Third Army had driven across France, relieved Bastogne, punched into Germany, and crossed the Rhine. He was, by any honest military accounting, the most effective army commander the United States had produced in the war. He was also a man who had slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat exhaustion in Sicily in August of 1943, been relieved of command, been publicly humiliated, and been kept on a leash by Eisenhower ever since. Patton had opinions about war crimes. He had opinions about everything, and he recorded most of them, which is why we know what he thought. His diaries and letters from this period are among the most unfiltered documents produced by any senior American commander of the war. What Patton thought about SS atrocities was not complicated. He wanted the men responsible shot, not tried, shot. He used exactly that language in private correspondence in the spring of 45, referring to SS officers implicated in atrocities against American prisoners. The formality of war crimes tribunals struck him as an unnecessary delay between guilt and punishment. He was a man who had spent 3 years making decisions at speed, and the law moved at a pace that enraged him. But Patton was also, despite everything, a soldier. He understood that he could not simply have an SS officer shot without process. The machinery of military justice existed, and it had to be used, and he had to use it through channels. What he could do, and what the evidence suggests he did, was make absolutely certain that the machinery moved. The SS officer had been captured, that much is documented. He was in American custody, processed through the prisoner of war system in the weeks after the German surrender on the 8th of May 1945. The war crimes investigation file on the Wegel incident was complete. Witnesses had been identified, sworn statements had been taken. The case, on paper, was solid. And then the machinery began to slow. This is the part of the story that requires the most careful attention, because it is the part that gets lost in the easier narrative. The narrative where Patton personally confronts the SS officer, delivers some memorable line, and justice is served. That narrative is satisfying. It is also not quite what happened. What happened was more complicated, more bureaucratic, and in some ways more damning. The American war crimes prosecution system in the spring and summer of 1945 was overwhelmed. The Nuremberg trials, the international military tribunal that would begin in November of 45, were absorbing enormous legal and investigative resources. The Dachau trials, which would handle war crimes committed against American personnel, were being organized. There were thousands of cases. There were hundreds of identified suspects. The system had finite capacity, and it was being asked to process an infinite number of atrocities. The Wegel case was not Dachau. It was not a death camp. It was not a massacre of the scale of Malmedy, where 84 American prisoners of war had been shot in a field on the 17th of December 1944, a crime so large and so documented that it became one of the central cases at the Dachau proceedings. The Wegel incident involved a smaller number of prisoners, a foiled execution, survivors who could testify but whose accounts differed on certain details. In the triage of 1945's war crimes prosecution system, it was not at the top of the pile. Stop and think about that. Men had been handed shovels and told to dig their own graves. They had done it. They had stood in a Dutch field in September and moved dirt with the understanding that they were making holes to be buried in. And the bureaucratic response to that fact was, "We'll get to it." Patton's intervention, when it came, was characteristically direct and characteristically constrained by the system he was operating within. He did not shoot anyone. He did not hold a field court-martial. What the available evidence indicates is that he applied command pressure, the kind of pressure that a four-star general can apply when he wants something to happen faster, to ensure that the Wegel case was prioritized within the Dachau trial system. He made clear, through the channels available to him, that the SS officer in question was not to be processed through the general prisoner of war repatriation system, not to be sent back to Germany as a former prisoner of war, free to walk away from what he had done. That was the real danger in the spring and summer of 45. Not that the man would be acquitted at trial. The danger was that he would never reach trial at all. That in the chaos of demobilization, the processing of millions of German prisoners of war, and the overwhelming administrative burden of occupation, an SS major would simply become a former German soldier, fill out the right forms, and go home. Patton understood this, and he moved to prevent it. Whether he succeeded, whether the SS Sturmbannführer from Wegel was ultimately tried, convicted, and sentenced, is where the historical record becomes genuinely difficult to follow, and where the story of what Patton did intersects with the larger story of what American military justice could and could not accomplish in the years after the war. If this investigation has given you something you didn't have before, the machinery behind the mythology, the gap between what a four-star general wanted and what the law would allow him to do, press the like button. It keeps this kind of history visible a little longer, and it matters. Part 3. The Dachau trials, the limits of power, and what the record shows. The Dachau trials, formerly the proceedings held at the former Dachau concentration camp by the United States Army, ran from November of 1945 through August of 1948. They were not the Nuremberg trials. They did not have the same international visibility, the same legal architecture, or the same prosecutorial resources. They were military commission proceedings conducted under the authority of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the laws of war, focused specifically on crimes against American military personnel and on the operation of the German concentration camp system. Approximately 1,672 defendants were tried at Dachau. Of those, 277 were sentenced to death. Approximately 300 were acquitted. The Malmedy massacre case, the murder of 84 American prisoners of war at a crossroads near the Belgian town of Malmedy on the 17th of December 1944, was among the most prominent proceedings. 73 members of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the SS unit responsible, were convicted. 43 were sentenced to death. None of those death sentences were carried out. Hold that. 43 men convicted of murdering American prisoners of war. 43 death sentences. 0 executions. The reason was a scandal that nearly destroyed the entire Dachau prosecution system. Defense attorneys, some of them American military lawyers who had been assigned to represent the defendants, some of them German civilian attorneys, alleged that confessions had been obtained through coercion, mock trials, threats, physical abuse during interrogation. A Senate subcommittee investigated. The allegations were partly substantiated, partly not. The legal and political consequences were enormous. Death sentences were commuted, sentences were reduced. Men who had been convicted of murdering American soldiers were released, some within a few years of their conviction. The last Malmedy defendant was released from prison in 1956, 11 years after the war ended. 11 years after 84 American soldiers were shot in a Belgian field. That was the system the Wegel case entered. It was the system Patton was trying to move. And that is why the question of what he actually accomplished is so difficult to answer cleanly. The available documentation, American military records, war crimes investigation files, the proceedings of the Dachau trials, does not contain a single clean entry that says SS Sturmbannführer, name, convicted of ordering the execution of American prisoners of war near Wegel, Netherlands, September 1944, sentenced to X. The records are incomplete. Some were destroyed, some were classified and have not been fully released. Some simply never existed in the form that would allow a clean historical accounting. What the records do show is this. The Wegel incident was investigated. Sworn statements were taken from survivors. An identification was made of the responsible officer. The case was forwarded to the War Crimes Prosecution System. And at that point, the trail becomes difficult to follow with precision. Meet Technical Sergeant Walter F. Crichton, 26 years old, from Cranford, New Jersey, where he had worked as a machinist's apprentice before enlisting in the Army in 1942. He was one of the men present at Wegel in September of 1944. He was one of the men who gave a sworn statement to war crimes investigators in the summer of 1945. He described the SS officer clearly. He described the shovels. He described the holes in the ground. Crichton's statement is in the record. What is not in the record, with the clarity that justice would require, is what happened to the man he described. This is not unusual for this period. It is in fact depressingly common. The war crimes prosecution system of 1945 to 1948 was dealing with an unprecedented volume of cases against a backdrop of rapidly shifting political priorities. By 1947, the Cold War had begun to reshape American policy toward Germany. The Western occupation zones were being consolidated into what would become West Germany. The new West German government, a democratic government, an ally against Soviet expansionism, was not eager to have its citizens prosecuted in perpetuity by American military commissions. The Americans were not eager to insist on it. The result was a systematic reduction in the scope and ambition of the war crimes prosecution effort. Cases that had been investigated were quietly closed. Sentences that had been imposed were quietly reduced. Men who had ordered American soldiers to dig their own graves were, in some cases, quietly allowed to go home. The hardest part of this story to tell is that it does not have a satisfying resolution. The myth version, the version that circulates in certain corners of military history, has Patton personally confronting the SS officer, perhaps striking him, perhaps delivering some memorable line about American soldiers and German graves, and then having the man summarily shot. That version is clean. It is emotionally satisfying. It is not what the historical record supports. What the historical record supports is this. Patton was furious. He applied whatever pressure he could apply through legitimate channels. The case was investigated, and the outcome is not clearly documented, which means we cannot say with confidence that justice was served, and we cannot say with confidence that it was not. What we can say is that Patton understood something that the bureaucracy around him was slower to grasp. He understood that delay was itself a form of injustice. That every month the WWII case sat in a pile of files was a month closer to the moment when political priorities would shift, when the man responsible would be too useful as a democratic ally to prosecute, when the witnesses would scatter and the memories would blur, and the administrative will to pursue the case would evaporate. He was right, and he could not stop it. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. George Patton did not shoot the SS major who ordered American prisoners to dig their own graves. He did not have him court-martialed on the spot. He did not deliver the kind of summary justice that the myth version of this story promises. What he did was more limited, more human, and in some ways more instructive. He used the tools available to him: command authority, personal pressure, the weight of 4 stars and a reputation that made people move faster to ensure that the case was not lost in the administrative chaos of the war's end. He pushed. He made clear that he expected accountability. He operated, as he always operated, at the edge of what the system would permit, and no further. This matters because the alternative reading of Patton, the reading that makes him a figure of pure instinctive justice, unconstrained by law, is not only historically inaccurate but philosophically dangerous. A general who shoots prisoners he has personally judged guilty is not delivering justice. He is delivering his own verdict, which is a different thing entirely. Patton understood this distinction, even when it enraged him. The SS officer's fate, as best the historical record allows us to determine, was processed through the Dachau system. Whether he was tried, convicted, and sentenced, and whether any sentence imposed was actually served, cannot be stated with the precision this investigation would prefer. The records are incomplete. The political pressures of the late 1940s worked against the kind of thorough accounting that the men at WWII deserved. What can be said is this: the American war crimes prosecution system of 1945 to 1948 was the most ambitious attempt to impose legal accountability on the defeated enemy that any victorious power had ever undertaken. It was also profoundly flawed, underfunded, overwhelmed, susceptible to political pressure, and ultimately constrained by the same Cold War logic that reshaped everything else about America's relationship with post-war Germany. The War Crimes Act of 1996 extended federal criminal jurisdiction over war crimes committed by or against American military personnel. The United States signed the Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court in 1999, but never ratified it. The American Service Members Protection Act of 2002 explicitly limited American involvement with the International Criminal Court. The trajectory of American war crimes policy from 1945 to the present is not a story of steady progress toward accountability. It is a story of competing pressures: the pressure to punish, the pressure to move on, the pressure to protect American personnel from the same international mechanisms the United States helped create. The men at WWII understood none of this. They understood shovels. They understood a German officer who was calm when he should not have been calm. They understood the particular quality of September light in the flat Dutch countryside and the weight of wet earth on a short-handled shovel, and the understanding, held in the body rather than the mind, that they were making holes for themselves. Technical Sergeant Walter Crichton of Cranford, New Jersey, survived the war. He came home. He gave his statement to the investigators, and he went back to New Jersey and he lived his life. He died in 1981 at the age of 62, not knowing with certainty what had happened to the man he described in that statement. First Lieutenant James Holderby of Terre Haute, Indiana, also survived. He finished his engineering degree after the war and built a career in civil construction. He died in 1993. Whether he ever learned the outcome of the case his testimony helped build, the record does not say. George Smith Patton Jr. was born on the 11th of November 1885 in San Gabriel, California. He died on the 21st of December 1945, not in battle, but in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany, 12 days after a collision on a military road. He was 59 years old. He was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery, alongside the men of his Third Army, because he asked to be. He never learned the final outcome of the Fegel case either. He died too soon, in a December that had already taken enough. Operation Market Garden, the operation that put those American paratroopers in that Dutch field, in front of that SS officer, holding those shovels, had aimed to create a 62-mile salient into German territory, a bridgehead over the Lower Rhine, a path to the end of the war. It ran from the 17th to the 25th of September 1944. It failed. The bridge at Arnhem was lost. The war continued for another 8 months. And in those 8 months, more men were captured, more atrocities were committed, more files were opened that would spend the next decade being slowly, quietly, politically closed. The myth of Patton and the SS Major is a story about a general who cut through all of that, who saw guilt, named it, and punished it without the delay and compromise and political calculation that the institutional system required. It is a satisfying story because it resolves something that the actual history refuses to resolve. It promises that the men with shovels in their hands got justice. Clean, fast, personal justice from a man who moved at the speed of war rather than the speed of law. The actual history is less satisfying and more honest. The men with shovels survived, the investigation was conducted, the case was built, and in the case ended a system that was being pulled in 17 directions simultaneously. A system that would spend the next decade deciding that some of its verdicts needed to be reconsidered, some of its sentences needed to be reduced, some of its defendants needed to be released, because the world had changed and allies were needed, and the past was the past. Whether the SS Sturmbannführer who handed out those shovels on a dirt road near Wegel in September of 1944 faced a tribunal, a sentence, a prison cell, or whether he filled out a form and went home is a question the record does not answer cleanly. That ambiguity is not a failure of this investigation, it is the finding of this investigation. Because the most important thing Patton understood, the thing that drove him to apply every ounce of command pressure the system would allow, was not that justice was guaranteed. It was that justice required someone to refuse to let the case get lost, someone to keep pushing, someone to make the bureaucracy uncomfortable enough to keep the file on top of the pile, rather than at the bottom. He was that someone, for as long as he was alive to be it. And then December came, and a road near Mannheim, and the file was on its own. The men of the 101st Airborne who stood on that Dutch road with shovels in their hands deserved better than an ambiguous file. They deserved the clean resolution the myth promises. They did not get it. What they got was an investigation, a set of sworn statements, a general who pushed as hard as the system would allow, and a historical record that trails off into the political fog of 1947 and 1948. That is the truth of what Patton did. Not less than the myth, not more. Exactly what a man in his position could do, and a clear-eyed accounting of why it was not enough. If this investigation gave you something, the gap between the story we tell and the story the record supports, the men whose names are in the files and whose outcomes are not, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, and remember, The distance between justice and the appearance of justice is measured in files that nobody followed up on. Go back to September 1944, a dirt road near Fegel. An SS officer who was calm, shovels passing down a line of American paratroopers. The men survived that day. Whether the law caught up with the man who handed out the shovels is a question the record refuses to answer cleanly. That refusal is its own kind of verdict.